Hello, everyone. Before we dive into these narratives, remember to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment detailing your location and viewing time. This helps YouTube ensure you continue to receive similar stories. Story 1. The Enigmatic Alaskan Backcountry Encounter. Several years prior, I orchestrated an extensive solo expedition into the remote Alaskan backcountry. This journey was intended to span a long weekend, featuring both camping and angling across various locales that my family had put forth. My father, having been born and raised in a small community near Anchorage, had spent the majority of his formative years pursuing hunting and backpacking endeavors throughout the vast expanse of the state. Having matured amidst countless remarkable tales from him, it felt only fitting to conceive a personal voyage to revisit and witness all the places and experiences my father so vividly described. The trip itself was rather minimalistic. While I consider myself a proficient outdoorsman, I understood the critical importance of never underestimating the Alaskan wilderness. I refrained from flying into deeply secluded, isolated territories or venturing too far off the beaten path. Instead, my preference was to remain within established recreational zones favored by campers and those who fish. I navigated along certain less traveled routes to foster a sense of seclusion from others, yet remained comfortably within 1 or 2 miles of the subsequent camping spot. Ultimately, I discovered an appealing inlet alongside a river, a place my father had assured me was an unparalleled location for fishing. This prime spot, however, seemed to have undergone transformations over the past 3 decades, as I failed to secure even a single bite throughout the entirety of the first day. Although no individuals were visibly present, I did observe indicators of prior human transit, potentially from local vagrants or transient individuals. These signs included bottle caps and fragments of plastic, nothing substantial but sufficient to confirm prior human presence. I proceeded upstream for a distance of a couple of miles, where I located profound pools in which fish were clearly discernible. Despite this, I still did not experience a single bite. I adjusted my fishing fly configuration, yet the outcome remained unchanged. I began to entertain the notion that I might be performing some aspect of my technique incorrectly. My suspicion that I was making an error intensified when I observed the fish behaving erratically, scattering in all conceivable directions. This struck me as particularly peculiar, as fish typically exhibit a unified movement, darting in a single direction when startled. For instance, shadows or objects traversing the water's surface usually cast a singular path, prompting fish to instinctively retreat away from the source of disturbance. However, this was not the phenomenon I witnessed. Instead, I saw them suspended effortlessly against the current, densely congregated at the rear of a pool. They appeared to be passively awaiting food to drift toward them from upstream. In the very next instant, they commenced swimming both against and with the current, with some even leaping vertically from the water. It ranked among the most bizarre displays I had ever witnessed from a school of fish, akin to their being subjected to an electric shock or similar stimulus. I merely attributed it to misfortune and persisted in my journey upstream. Before the day concluded, I did manage to have some success, catching a few fish suitable for my evening meal. As I progressed further upstream, the surrounding forested area transitioned into an expansive, undulating meadow. In this meadow, the waterway expanded, forming numerous channels that meandered in various trajectories. I lingered there for a while, inspecting my gear, fishing the available pools, and simply appreciating the scenic vista. The sun pierced through the overcast sky, dissipating some of the ambient cold. It was then that I became aware of a peculiar buzzing sound, I had initially perceived it upon entering the open area, but it had swiftly faded, leading me to assume it was merely a ringing in my ears or some similar auditory anomaly. I continued to hear this sound intermittently over the subsequent hour, while I remained in that particular clearing. Each time it would only last for a brief duration before ceasing abruptly. I surveyed the landscape, contemplating the possibility of someone operating a quad bike or dirt bike deeper within the valley. The stillness was such that I felt confident it must be at least 5 or 6 miles distant. Regardless of its origin, my curiosity waned as the day progressed. Given the finite amount of daylight available for activities in the wilderness, after I had safely stored my fish, I engaged in some leisurely hiking for the remainder of the afternoon. I ascended some gentle slopes. I captured several breathtaking photographs and gradually descended along the river, heading back towards my campsite. Throughout the entire day, I neither saw nor heard anyone, apart from the aforementioned buzzing noise. As I made my descent through the river gorge, I believed I caught sight of an individual on the opposite bank, stealthily moving behind the boundary of trees. I halted completely and waited for them to reappear. Given that I was camping in an unfamiliar location, approaching others in a cordial manner seemed logical. My intention was to inquire about the river and any promising fishing locations. This was especially pertinent as I planned to remain there for the ensuing days. However, no one emerged. I scrutinized the area back and forth, even stepping backward a few paces to gain an improved perspective of the dense foliage. A sense of unease began to settle over me. I was convinced of what I had just observed. Why would they conceal themselves from me? I called out a greeting but received no reply. With a renewed determination, I began to hasten my return to camp. For another mile, I continuously glanced over my shoulder, yet saw no one. I began to mentally construct more plausible explanations in my mind. Perhaps I hadn't actually seen anyone. It was more probable that it was merely shadows, tree branches, or even leaves deceiving my perception. It could even have been a small creature approaching to investigate my presence. Observing a bend in the river ahead, I decided to take the opportunity to conceal myself within some foliage and survey the trail behind me. True to my suspicion, I soon detected the same individual, stealthily advancing approximately a quarter mile behind me. His movements were exceedingly precise and intentional, clearly aimed at avoiding any disturbance to the brush or generating any noticeable sounds. It was almost fascinating to observe him so naturally in his surroundings, unaware that I had him in sight. After a few additional minutes, he glanced upward, perceived my presence, offered a wave, and then vanished into the trees. What on earth was that? The entire encounter was unsettling, but the most perplexing aspect was his appearance. From a distance, he seemed paramilitary, adorned with what looked like a tactical vest and a chest rig. Perhaps he was a photographer or something of that nature. I couldn't be sure. That might account for the multitude of pockets, and it would also elucidate his silent demeanor. Regardless, I maintained my brisk pace, leaving this individual far behind. The remainder of the afternoon and evening unfolded as serenely as the smoke from my crackling campfire. I prepared the fish, generously filling them with garlic and butter, and enjoyed a truly outstanding dinner beneath the shimmering stars. I used a bone from a larger fish to pick my teeth, immersing myself in the complete experience. I envisioned my father camping in close proximity years ago, enjoying a comparable evening. There was a profound sense of satisfaction in performing the same actions in the same locale as he had. I grew weary early, as was typical for me. Consequently, I secured my campsite and retired to my tent for the night. A robust, roaring fire burned steadily throughout the evening, casting its glow near my spacious canvas tent, which was large enough for me to stand upright in and was pitched between two trees. I listened to the gentle crackle of the flames and gradually drifted into sleep as the firelight diminished. Suddenly, I found myself wide awake, though without understanding the cause. Something felt amiss, activating my innate sense of alertness, even before I opened my eyes. It was then that the realization struck me. I could perceive light penetrating through my eyelids. My initial assumption was that the man I had encountered by the river earlier was now directing a flashlight through the entrance of my tent. However, my eyes snapped open only to find the opposite. I was entirely alone. My tent remained fully zipped, and I could still discern the diminishing embers of my fire pit. From this, I estimated the time to be around midnight, perhaps 1 a.m. Yet there was something else, a distinct light, situated a short distance from my tent, perhaps 15 feet away, nestled within the trees. I strained to hear any sound, but there was absolute silence. No engine noise, no footsteps. The nearby road, in fact, intersected with my campsite in the opposing direction, meaning there was no accessible area for a vehicle to be positioned there. An additional element was the source of the light itself. It appeared to descend directly from the sky, forming a solitary, unwavering column extending approximately 40 feet upward. I struggled to comprehend the sight, and for several minutes I was convinced I must be dreaming. What else could this possibly be? Extraterrestrial beings? I found that improbable. Then, as suddenly as it appeared, it vanished. All traces of the light receded into darkness, and that section of my tent was no longer illuminated. Having considerable experience in wilderness environments, I routinely carry a firearm whenever I venture into such locales. For this inaugural trip to Alaska, I had brought a Smith & Wesson 10mm pistol, chosen for its effectiveness against the diverse range of predators found there. It is a formidable caliber, and I kept it positioned beneath my sleeping cot. The very moment my hand grasped it, the celestial light reappeared, this time directly above my campsite. It manifested as a substantial pillar of light, perhaps 20 feet in diameter, radiating an intense uniform white from top to bottom. I became utterly motionless. Even with the weapon in hand, I recognized my profound helplessness. Unsure of how to react, I propelled myself out of my sleeping bag and immediately began to get dressed. I tugged on my boots and tucked my pistol securely into my waistband. Cautiously, I unzipped the tent and peered out with a single eye. The light was so incredibly blinding that I would have been unable to discern anything even if I had dared to look directly upward. Yet my truck and the rest of my campsite remained perfectly visible, illuminated as if in broad daylight. Whatever this phenomenon was, it was completely silent and utterly motionless, like a surgeon poised for an operation. The light source maintained its unwavering position as it drifted effortlessly above me. Then I heard it once more, that familiar buzzing sound. This time, it was closer. This time, however, it was an exact match to the earlier sound. Before I could process this new piece of information, the light abruptly extinguished itself once more. I wasted no precious moments. I hastily pulled on my jacket, laced up my boots, and launched into an all-out sprint towards the tree line. My campsite was situated in a minor clearing, but dense woodland lay merely a stone's throw away. These thicker trees, I reasoned, would offer significantly superior concealment from whatever entity hovered above me. I plunged headlong into the dense brush, not pausing to regain my composure. The branches raked against me from head to foot. This minor discomfort, however, was a far lesser peril compared to the illuminating phenomenon in the sky. I forced my way through the initial dense barrier of branches, emerging with my face and hands marred by scratches. To my left, I could discern a hill, and directly ahead, what appeared to be a rocky outcrop. I lacked a flashlight and had no desire to risk an ankle injury in such an environment, so I opted to carefully ascend the hillside. Navigating rocks in the darkness presented too high a risk, particularly given my rapid movement. I reached nearly the halfway point up the hill and discovered a large oak tree possessing substantial branches. Despite being completely devoid of leaves amongst the surrounding trees, it appeared to be the most straightforward to ascend, and it still offered the necessary concealment from the surrounding arboreal canopy. I extended my reach, pulling myself into its gnarled gray branches, and continued to climb until I was at least 15 feet above the ground. As I ascended, that same pillar of light reanimated itself directly above my campsite. From my elevated position, I could partially observe my camp and a section of my truck, along with the unzipped opening of my tent. The light remained suspended, and I could determine that it was emanating from a singular point of origin, though the darkness prevented me from identifying the source itself. Subsequently, it began to move, tracing the path I had taken as I fled into the trees. As it traversed the treetops along my route, the light once again extinguished itself. Now, perched in the tree, I could distinctly hear it whining, no longer merely buzzing. At this juncture, I felt I had exhausted all options, so I retrieved my pistol and simply waited. My resolve was to discharge every round into that entity if it ever directed its illuminating beam upon me. It reactivated a few minutes later, positioned at the base of the hill where I had diverged from the primary trail. It remained there for an extended period, in what felt like the longest stretch of the night. After perhaps 10 minutes, it powered down and then commenced making circuits throughout the forest. I could actually hear it whiz past me a couple of times directly above the oak tree in which I was concealed. My hope was that by ascending from the ground into a tree, whatever this phenomenon was, would be unable to detect me. It appeared my assumption was correct. The remainder of the night passed, as one might anticipate, with me clenching my pistol tightly and simply listening intently and observing the light as it periodically activated and deactivated. Subsequently, I heard a shout. It was the very same greeting I had called out towards the river earlier. Evidently, it was not my voice, but a singular, clear call. It was almost as if someone was deliberately mocking me. I ascended slightly higher into the tree and remained crouched for the remainder of the night. By the break of dawn, I had not seen or heard any sign of it for a considerable duration, perhaps close to an hour. The moment I noticed the sky beginning to lighten, I scrambled down and rushed back to my campsite. Upon reaching it, I plunged back into my sleeping bag. I was utterly frozen from having spent the entire night outdoors, and my sole desire was to sleep. Nothing further disturbed me throughout the remainder of the excursion. I later made contact with one of the families camping further down the road. They informed me that they had not observed any type of light similar to what I described. However, they confirmed hearing the buzzing sound, stating it would appear and disappear, sometimes even in the afternoon. It was highly peculiar, yet provided no definitive answer to my experience. The conclusion of the trip arrived, and I returned home. I recounted the events to my father. He was entirely bewildered and genuinely had no comprehension of what to make of the entire ordeal. He speculated it sounded like a military operation, yet neither of us could conceive why they would trouble a lone camper, particularly one likely armed. The whole incident transcended the realm of strangeness, and I had no idea whom to approach for an explanation. Years afterward, I conversed with an individual who recounted a remarkably similar experience. He had been camping within a secluded patch of forest in the Four Corners region when his campsite became illuminated in an identical manner to mine. Unlike me, he did not flee from his camp, instead choosing to endure the phenomenon until it dissipated. The following day, he reported his sighting to the Forest Ranger Service. They clarified that illegal cultivation operations were present in the vicinity, and local law enforcement employed drones to pinpoint these illicit farms at night, allowing them to precisely target locations for raids. They offered an apology stating that the drone operator must have mistakenly identified his camp as being associated with the grow operation. We then compared our respective experiences and nearly every detail aligned. The persistent buzzing sound, the profound silence, the intense, all-encompassing light, and its ethereal, phantom-like movement from one location to another. I remain uncertain as to who might have operated a drone in the remote Alaskan wilderness during the late 1990s, but it terrified me immensely. What I genuinely long to understand is whether it was a civilian or a government initiative, and I often ponder if they possess any photographs of me from that night. Story 2. The House on 11th Avenue Scandal. In Anchorage, a residence situated on 11th Avenue, in close proximity to the downtown area, boasts an expansive multi-level deck, complete with a hot tub positioned on its uppermost tier, designed to afford a panoramic vista. From the street, as one drives by, this hot tub was conspicuously visible. For a period, it became somewhat of an oddity, though it has since been taken down, at least based on my last observation. In its prime, it was considered a genuinely extravagant location. All local residents would readily recount tales of it. Numerous individuals visiting the town would inquire about it, as it conveyed the impression that a celebrity resided there. This particular house served as a frequent gathering place for influential executives from oil corporations and political figures. It functioned almost as an exclusive private club, catering to the exceedingly wealthy and influential members of Anchorage society. However, ordinary working-class citizens never gained entry to its interior. It was undeniably a venue for revelry, yet many of us were unaware of its true, more sinister nature. The whispers began conventionally enough. Speculation that gambling, heavy drinking, and drug use occurred there. It was assumed card games were hosted, and that escorts and entertainers were likely present, along with definitive discussions shaping the future of our esteemed state. The grim reality, however, proved to be far more disturbing than those initial conjectures. The operations at the house on 11th Avenue commenced precisely as the community had surmised, but they rapidly deteriorated into a horrifying sex trafficking and blackmail enterprise, comparable to the most shocking narratives dominating current headlines. At that time, a prominent corporation named Apex Metals Corp. was a significant entity here, renowned as a leader in metal manufacturing. The individuals who governed this company began to exhibit excessive arrogance and adopted an increasingly extravagant way of life. They became deeply enmeshed in the local cocaine underworld, forging connections with both politicians and their drug suppliers. Over time, these individuals, according to accounts I've received, found themselves perpetually unsatisfied by anything. There was an insatiable demand for drugs or alcohol, and never enough women. The entirety of the North Slope became permeated by cocaine, and the key figures overseeing this resource-rich area unwittingly initiated a sex trafficking ring involving minors. This vile network operated between the senior executives of Apex Metals Corp. and their depraved drug dealers. Their modus operandi involved ensnaring young girls, rendering them severely addicted to cocaine, and subsequently compelling them to reside within the house on 11th Avenue. Thereafter, these girls became permanent fixtures exploited and abused by various individuals, completely unbeknownst to the outside world. Furthermore, these girls, as long as they could obtain their next dose, exhibited no desire to depart. In the early 2000s, Apex Metals Corp. faced impending bankruptcy and was subsequently acquired by a corporation known as Global Solutions, Inc., which I understand was headquartered in Colorado. Approximately concurrently, young women began to come forward, leveling incredibly disturbing accusations against politicians and prominent business leaders within the Anchorage region. These accounts detailed situations involving kidnapping, sexual assault, and hostage-taking, precisely the sort of grim narratives one would associate with sex trafficking. As years passed, an increasing number of young women stepped forward, some growing more determined and desiring to approach the press, to publish their allegations and to commence building formal legal cases. Disturbingly, every single one of these women over the past 2 decades has either been coerced into silence through intimidation or has completely vanished, never to be seen again. Fundamentally, the individuals who controlled the cocaine-driven North Slope in the 1980s ultimately established a child sex trafficking network designed to cater to the desires of politicians and other Alaskan and oil industry elites. Their method involved rendering these young girls dependent on cocaine and then exploiting them for sexual purposes. The entire sordid affair was comprehensively suppressed by local law enforcement and political figures, with very little of it ever becoming public knowledge. While I am not of an age to personally recall these events, my uncle was a significant figure in the cocaine distribution network across the Anchorage area during the 1980s. Although he did not directly cater to these specific individuals, he was intricately involved with many of their suppliers. Consequently, he never disclosed any information he possessed publicly, fearing culpability by association. Both my uncle and I believe the cover-up was so thoroughly executed, not solely due to the involvement of the police, but also because the very individuals responsible for funding their budgets were implicated in the activities at the house on 11th Avenue. Furthermore, the ongoing corporate acquisition between Apex Metals Corp. and Global Solutions Inc. played a crucial role. Whether Apex Metals Corp. was endeavoring to safeguard its reputation to ensure the sale, or Global Solutions Inc. was intervening to eliminate any potential liabilities and guarantee the integrity of their purchase, the outcome was the same. In either scenario, the extent of influence a major corporation can exert over a community is profoundly unsettling. Story 3. The Unsettling North Slope Wanderer. In previous years, I was employed in Alaska's North Slope, specifically within the oil industry. The nature of our work necessitated extensive travel deep into the Alaskan Petroleum Reserve, an expanse that fundamentally comprises hundreds of miles of wild, untamed tundra wilderness. During the winter season, oil corporations would construct protracted ice roads that served as conduits to exploratory drilling sites. Our specific responsibility involved proceeding to these sites subsequent to the initial drilling operations to assess rock formations for their capacity to yield oil. This particular occasion occurred in mid-January. The sun had not yet fully ascended. When I state that the sun had not risen, I mean it had not appeared for nearly a month and a half. The phenomenon of polar nights is exceptionally severe. The specific well site we were en route to was situated approximately 60 miles west of Alpine, Alaska, deep within the remote wilderness. Our assignment typically consumed a week, but we had completed it and were now journeying back to camp to conclude our work period before returning home. At both the commencement and termination points of these ice roads, there are guard shacks where one must sign in and out for safety protocols. Cellular reception is non-existent, and radios function only within a limited range. If one fails to check in or out by a designated time, search parties are dispatched to confirm one has not succumbed to the cold. It was approximately 4 in the morning, though the precise hour held little significance in a region experiencing perpetual darkness. We were roughly midway along the ice road, our progress slow due to the 25-mile-per-hour speed limit imposed on these thoroughfares. Suddenly, an apparition materialized in the beam of our headlights. It was a man, dressed in jeans, sneakers, and a hooded jacket. walking along an ice road in the desolate tundra wilderness at 4 a.m. The external temperature was likely around -20 degrees Fahrenheit. It is not uncommon for local Inuit individuals to venture this far for hunting. We considered the possibility that his snowmobile had malfunctioned and he was attempting to return to the guard shack, which seemed a plausible scenario. He offered no acknowledgement of our presence as our vehicle pulled alongside him. He simply continued to shuffle forward. He did not appear to be affected by the cold. Surprisingly, his attire, although utterly unsuitable for such extreme climatic conditions, seemed both warm and dry. We also observed that he was not of Inuit descent, but rather Caucasian. I lowered my window and inquired if he required any assistance, asking if he was all right. He continued to ignore us, persistently shuffling onward. His countenance was utterly devoid of expression, entirely lacking any indication of thought or emotion. Some of my companions in the truck proposed that he might have been involved in an accident and was experiencing shock. I maintained my truck's slow pace alongside him as he continued his determined trek down the road, persistently attempting to elicit a reaction. Even amidst the severe cold, I occasionally detected faint whiffs of a peculiar odor emanating directly from him. He had an acidic scent, if that descriptor makes any sense. There was a pervasive sense of unease surrounding this man that caused the hairs on my neck to prickle. The individual seated behind me in the truck's crew cab had reached his limit with the situation. He lowered his window and extended his arm to grasp the man. He later informed me that his intention was simply to attempt to rouse him from his apparent stupor. Before my friend's hand could make contact, this walking popsicle spun abruptly and latched onto my buddy's outstretched arm. He directed a gaze of unadulterated rage at both my friend and me, his grip unwavering on the arm. If emotions possessed a physical temperature, this man's fury could have liquefied the entire tundra that very night. My friend let out a pained groan as he struggled to dislodge his arm from Mr. Popsicle's grasp. At that very instant, this individual began screaming directly into our faces. That scream contained such a profound intensity of hatred, rage, and anger that it was utterly terrifying. I slammed the accelerator, causing the truck to spin briefly on the ice before the tires gained traction, propelling us forward. The popsicle dude still maintained his grip on my friend's arm, attempting to wrench him out of the truck. He was running alongside the vehicle while the other occupants in the cab clung to my friend, striving to keep him inside. After what felt like several long moments, though it could have been no more than a few seconds, my friend finally broke free from the man's grip, and we sped desperately towards the guard shack, located another 30 miles down the road. Upon arriving, we checked in with the guards and reported the bizarre incident we had witnessed. The guard clearly eyed us as though we were attempting to perpetrate some elaborate hoax, but protocol dictated they investigate regardless. My friend's arm was tender, and upon rolling up his sleeve, a distinct bruise in the precise shape of a hand was visible around his arm. We completed a formal report with the guard, and were then instructed to proceed back to our camp. None of us felt inclined to discuss the events that had transpired during the silent drive back to our camp. The following day, we flew home. The next occasion we encountered that same guard at his post, we inquired if he had ever located Mr. Popsicle during his patrol. He informed us that they had conducted a thorough search, traversing the entire ice road for a continuous 12-hour shift, but had found nothing, not even footprints veering off the road into the snow. He maintained it was an excellent prank and vowed to retaliate for making him expend an entire shift driving around. However, it was undeniably not a prank. Who would fabricate such a story, and who would deliberately inflict a bruise upon their own arm for a senseless joke? We never received a conclusive explanation for what occurred that evening. To this day, I continue to ponder about that individual, if it was even an individual at all. The Alaskan tundra is an inherently strange environment, and that particular incident was just one among numerous peculiar narratives from my period spent there. I made efforts to document more of my experiences and disseminate them to relevant online communities. Story 4: The Uninvited Camper. A few years prior, 2 companions and I embarked on a squirrel hunting excursion in a creek bottom location. We were engaged in a substantial wilderness camping expedition and had erected several tents following our Saturday morning hunt. As the day progressed into the late afternoon, dark clouds began to accumulate, and we could discern the ominous rumbling of thunder drawing progressively nearer. Swiftly, we retrieved a large tarp from the bed of my pickup truck and suspended it between our tents, necessitating the repositioning of one tent to ensure it was adequately covered. Annually, we convene with our group for an extensive outdoor trip, typically lasting approximately 1 week. This type of venture demanded the establishment of a campsite capable of sustaining us for the entire duration, meaning avoiding issues like washouts, firewood scarcity, or any other persistent problems, if at all possible. Describing the precise layout of our camp is somewhat challenging. We had 2 sizable old-fashioned ball tents, characterized by external poles positioned facing each other. The substantial, heavy tarp was suspended and supported by cut saplings partially extending over both tents. We had secured the tarp quite firmly using white nylon cord, which we referred to as trot line, and we had strategically dug out the fire pit at the edge of the tarp, ensuring its overhang would allow smoke to clear. With the approaching storm, further hunting, at least for the time being, was out of the question. Consequently, we kindled the fire, set a pot of coffee to brew, and began preparing something sweet to cook. I cannot recall the exact dish, but it was bubbling enticingly at the side of the fire. We had ingeniously constructed a multi-layered spit from which 4 squirrels were beginning to roast. One of my friends was crouched, diligently turning them. Each of us would take turns rotating the spit until the squirrels were fully cooked. The storm, which had been merely hinting at its arrival, now struck with full force. Torrential rain, deafening thunder, and intense lightning raged all around us. Despite the tempest, we felt secure and comfortable, collectively congratulating ourselves on our resilience in camping out amidst such a fierce woodland storm. None of us possessed a pistol. We only had 3 shotguns. Mine was an 870 pump model, and I distinctly recall it resting against one of the many saplings supporting our tarp. We harbored little concern regarding potential camp intruders, as the heavy rainfall would likely compel most predators to remain sheltered for the duration of the night. The rain was so incredibly dense, rendering visibility almost impossible. Between the downpour and the firelight, we were confident that no bears or wolves would bother us. Even if they did, our plan was simply to unleash our 12-gauge shotguns on them and then conclude our evening. For this extensive camping excursion, we had brought out our old-fashioned lawn chairs, characteristic of the era around 1979. 2 of us were seated in ours, observing the third friend as he rotated the squirrels and managed the coffee. Suddenly, and I mean with such speed that we did not even perceive its occurrence, a man simply walked beneath our tarp and stood there holding a rifle horizontally across his body with both arms. He had approached along one side of my tent and had just stepped under the shelter of the tarp. Immediate shock and utter pandemonium erupted. I recoiled, causing my chair to collapse, desperate to distance myself from this stranger. I scrambled frantically for my shotgun. One of my friends literally stumbled into the fire he had been tending, so profoundly startled was he. He sustained some burns to his hands and face, but his jacket fortunately absorbed the majority of the heat. Had he suffered severe burns, there would have been no feasible way for us to extract him from the wilderness and transport him to a hospital, certainly not amidst such a storm and muddy conditions. Our third friend immediately sprang up and bolted headfirst into his own tent, causing it to become severely dislodged. He later confessed that he believed he had packed a pistol and was frantically searching through his duffel bag, only to discover it empty. The man who had entered beneath the tarp began to shout something akin to, "Whoa, whoa, whoa, whoa!" I extricated myself from the collapsed chair and sprang to my feet. In that moment, I believed we were doomed. There was an armed man standing directly before us. However, he was not brandishing the weapon. Its bolt was pulled back, and he continued to hold it horizontally across his chest. It seemed he was attempting to signal surrender of some sort. We ceased our frantic shouts and allowed a profound stillness to settle over us, everyone refraining from any discernible movement. Even our friend, still inside his tent, cautiously poked his head out to observe the situation. It was a genuine standoff, the sole one I have ever experienced. Had he carried that rifle in any other posture, I am certain we would have eliminated him out of sheer terror, a potentially life-altering mistake. Once the tension somewhat subsided, it became apparent that the man was simply completely disoriented. He had already lost his bearings when the storm commenced, and was now merely wandering through the relentless downpour. He had detected the scent of smoke from our fire and the aroma of the cooking squirrels, which had led him directly to our camp. His rifle was merely a bolt-action .22 caliber with a magazine. He was just a casual day hiker who found himself in distress when the inclement weather struck. Despite his harmlessness, the entire scenario and the man himself deeply unnerved me. He possessed an unsettlingly wide, ear-to-ear grin that appeared almost impossibly broad, akin to something from a special effects production. I found it extremely difficult to meet his gaze because it disturbed me to such a profound degree. I'm unsure if the firelight distorted his features with strange shadows or what the cause was, but I seemed to be the only one who perceived it. Furthermore, he appeared to blink infrequently, even with water trickling into his eyes. Once the man realized the extent to which he had frightened all of us, he offered profuse apologies. We ultimately drove the man in my truck, transporting him to the paved road and further along to the pipeline where his vehicle was parked. This was a straightforward drive of approximately half a mile across relatively level terrain, so I undertook the risk simply to remove him from our camp. Although the man was entirely non-threatening, he ought to have announced his presence before ducking beneath our tarp, and perhaps behaved more conventionally once he did. He genuinely terrified us all to a significant degree. Story 5. The Juneau Beach Stalkers. On one occasion, while in Juneau, Alaska, for a business engagement, I chose to drive northward out of the city after completing my work for the day. My intention was to explore various beaches, stopping at them at random. I paused at one, enjoying a solitary and pleasant time on the shoreline, observing the avian life, watching for fish, and examining the tidal pools. A pickup truck then arrived in the parking area situated above me. I gave it little thought initially. The truck subsequently performed a Brody, a tight, high-speed spin, then departed, heading north. I have spent considerable time at these secluded trailheads and frequently encounter various types of unsavory individuals, local adolescents engaging in marijuana use, others involved in illicit hookups, and all manner of irresponsible driving behaviors such as burnouts and tight spins, essentially whatever the parking lot can facilitate. These trailheads commonly serve rural communities where recreational options are scarce, thereby transforming the modest paved area into a form of entertainment in itself. I continued to stroll further along the beach. A few minutes later, the same truck returned. It briefly parked at the overlook, which was approximately 50 feet higher in elevation than the beach, separated by a bluff. They simply remained there for a while, then once again accelerated away, this time heading south. By now, I was feeling distinctly uneasy, and on this occasion, I began to make my way back toward the trail, aiming to reach my vehicle. Since I was clad in dark attire, I remained somewhat close to the tree line for concealment. I endeavored to maintain some vegetation between myself and any potential line of sight they might have. It was precisely then that the truck reappeared for a third time. It parked with its headlights directed squarely at me as the twilight was descending. I remained still. Then, for a third instance, it sped away once more, but this time I could discern that it halted precisely where my car was parked. I heard the engine disengage. At that exact moment, every primal instinct within me screamed for me to conceal myself. I abandoned the beach and plunged directly into the woods, moving somewhat uphill. Juneau is characterized by its large trees, and I located one that had fallen. I positioned myself on its far side, reasoning that if they possessed a flashlight, they would locate me instantly. Regrettably, my cell phone had an extremely weak signal, and I was unarmed, as I typically do not carry weapons when traveling by air. All circumstances in that moment felt overwhelmingly against me. By this point, I was absolutely terrified. Then I heard a distinct slam. I immediately understood that there were at least 2 individuals. I surmised they had waited for a period, perhaps to ascertain if I would reappear on the trail. Now they were beginning their descent down the pathway. One of the men seemed to be carrying a long object. I suspected it was a rifle, but in the diminishing light, it could have been a bat or something else entirely. He was also calling out, "Hello, where are you?" Abruptly, I felt as though I had unwittingly entered the most dangerous game. I remained concealed, my heart pounding uncontrollably. I waited until the men were well down on the beach before I began to ascend the hill, moving into the woods where I knew the parking lot was located. I attempted to move silently, but it proved impossible. Dried leaves and dead wood covered the ground, and I was generating a considerable amount of noise. Fortunately for me, I do not believe they heard me. Upon reaching my car, the truck unsettled me. Its windows were completely tinted, making it impossible to ascertain if anyone was still inside. I started my vehicle and sped away from the location. I have engaged in solitary hiking throughout my entire life, often venturing into places far more isolated than this one. Yet never before or since have I experienced that profound sensation of being in imminent grave danger. To this very day, I do not believe I overreacted, and I am absolutely convinced that those men harbored malicious intentions for me had they managed to apprehend me. Story 6: The Aggressive Wolf Pack. This particular expedition marked only my second time ever hunting, accompanied by my father and 2 of his acquaintances. We were situated in southeast Alaska on an island where we had established our camp in the central area of a moderately sized cove, which possessed a distinct U-shape. The shoreline was encompassed by a mountain range of a comparable form, extending inland as you proceeded. Our intention was to remain for 4 days to pursue deer. Throughout the first and second days, my father and I ascended a few hundred feet to various locations, but encountered no success whatsoever, finding only winding paths through ancient forests. On the evening of the second day, our party observed a wolf emerging from the tree line directly across the cove. It reclined on the shoreline, and after a brief interval, another larger wolf appeared and joined what we presumed to be its mate. They settled beside the initial wolf. Subsequently, the first wolf shifted a few yards away from them, leading us to deduce that the largest wolf was the pack's alpha male. This was our first sighting or auditory encounter with them in our immediate vicinity during this particular trip. By the morning of the third day, the reason for our inability to locate any deer became unequivocally clear. The wolves were also actively hunting. We had not encountered any indicators of their presence because they were meticulously avoiding leaving any scent trails or tracks. They were effectively taking down deer during the quieter off hours, which rendered the herds exceptionally vigilant. However, one night they did commence howling with distinct aggression. This sustained howling persisted throughout the entirety of the remaining trip. It is important to note that while films and other forms of media often suggest wolves howl randomly, or that one can always hear a singular loud howl, this is entirely inaccurate. These particular wolves were howling with a deliberate objective: to frighten the deer around the cove and then to herd them into a corner. The pack initiated their howling directly at the tip of the cove, their discordant vocalizations reverberating for miles and miles, and then systematically began to advance around and towards our position. My father and I once again ascended the slope, as there was no other course of action. This time, we were situated several hundred feet higher. We again heard the wolves howling, but one howl stood out, being both louder and closer than the others. We paused beneath a fallen tree trunk to listen intently, and we perceived the howl drawing progressively nearer. I was equipped with a bolt-action rifle, and my father instructed me to load a round. He, too, drew a handgun and loudly racked its slide, attempting to deter the approaching wolf. The howling intensified, nearing our position from above. A few minutes later, I found myself gazing up the mountain slope, through the ancient forest. I observed an animal moving, its nose diligently sniffing the ground. It was the alpha wolf, no more than 30 yards from our location, meticulously tracking the scent of another animal. It must have been fully aware of our presence through scent, sound, and sight. Yet for some inexplicable reason, it simply chose to disregard us. Unsurprisingly, we failed to locate any deer during that particular hunting trip. Story 7. The Haunted Campus. For more than 5 years, concurrent with my studies, I held a position as a janitor at the University of Alaska, Fairbanks. It is a relatively obscure fact, but a significant number of individuals, including both students and faculty members, are convinced that the campus is entirely haunted. Their beliefs stem from various sources, ranging from eerie ancient legends concerning the land upon which the university was constructed, to tales circulating about the individuals who built it, and simply the numerous instances of deaths occurring on campus throughout the years. Regardless of the specific rationale, it is quite commonplace to overhear discussions about flickering lights, peculiar sounds, and similar occurrences. People regularly encounter strange phenomena here and simply attribute them to the paranormal. There was, however, one particular individual who did not possess any prior knowledge of these stories, being newly employed and simply disbelieving in ghosts or any similar spectral phenomena. One evening, he was assigned to theater duty. This entailed a protracted shift where the assigned janitor or janitors were confined to a single building for anywhere from 4 to 6 hours, or for whatever duration was required to thoroughly clean the entire facility, empty trash receptacles, and attend to all other duties. There is an additional building situated directly behind the theater that is also included in this same assignment. I cannot recall the name of this particular structure, but it is positioned between the engineering building and the library. He resigned from his position that very night, on the spot, during his shift. I was overseeing a team at the time. He contacted me in a state of extreme agitation and panic, declaring that he was unable to complete cleaning the building and was resigning forthwith, insisting that I needed to come immediately to retrieve the keys. In the back of my mind, I possessed some inkling of the situation, having personally witnessed and heard a few strange things myself while cleaning within that theater. I had learned several stories after making inquiries among my colleagues, but personally, I simply did not allow them to concern me. The auditory disturbances and the inexplicable locking and unlocking of doors, as well as the occasional apparitions, did not deter me from needing to fulfill my financial obligations. Consequently, I made every effort to disregard them and simply continued performing my duties. So in any case, I went to collect the keys from him. He was ashen-faced, as pale as a ghost himself, with beads of sweat trickling down his face and his entire body trembling. He spoke frantically of having witnessed a human figure silently gliding across the stage. I was somewhat at a loss for words, so I simply replied, "Yes, that sometimes occurs, my friend. It's mostly just sounds, though occasionally it's a visual manifestation or the doors themselves. One eventually becomes accustomed to it." He departed with such haste that he did not remain to speak with our supervisor. The supervisor, a somewhat pragmatic individual, despite being the one who first recounted tales of spectral encounters to me, ended up believing I had intentionally frightened the new employee away. It was only years later that I learned a person had actually committed suicide by hanging themselves on that very stage. Story 8. The Unarmed Guard Duty on Adak Island. I recall it being the winter of 1997 when I was residing in Alaska and fulfilling my service in the National Guard, specifically as an 11 Bravo infantryman. I thoroughly enjoyed the experience. As some may be aware, a joint task force comprising all branches of the military commenced operations to construct a road on a nearby location known as Adak Island. During the summer months, the Marine Corps component established the headquarters, which consisted of a collection of plywood huts and the foundational structure of a mess hall. By the end of summer, these huts were essentially basic shelters devoid of electricity or running water. 5 other members of my unit and I were subsequently called to active duty. Our assignment was to reside on the island throughout the winter, tasked with safeguarding the camp. Ostensibly, the local indigenous youth would traverse from island to island, defacing abandoned logging camps and similar unoccupied sites. This operation was officially designated as a training mission for budgetary reasons. Initially, it appeared to be an enjoyable prospect. 6 months spent on a distant island during winter, inhabiting a simple plywood hut. In the beginning, circumstances proved somewhat challenging. Only 4 to 5 of us were stationed on the island at any given time, with a weekend rotation occurring every 2 or 3 weeks for 1 or 2 individuals. It took a few months before we acquired a functional generator or propane for cooking. Consequently, we sustained ourselves on MREs, meals ready to eat, for all 3 daily meals for a considerable duration. The most inconvenient aspect was the presence of only a single outhouse in the entire camp, positioned several hundred yards from our living quarters. To exacerbate matters, the commanding officers, for reasons unknown, had designated the ground as sacred, explicitly prohibiting us from relieving ourselves upon it. This mandate implied that any need for urination or defecation necessitated a trek to the outhouse through the frigid Alaskan winter conditions. For the most part, I found the experience highly enjoyable. We forged strong bonds, shared humor, engaged in games like push-up poker, and generally reveled in the rugged outdoor lifestyle. To elaborate further, the most arduous segment of winter arrived, bringing with it an abundance of snow. By then, we had acquired peculiar heaters that operated on diesel fuel, providing a degree of warmth within our huts. However, the sole structure that remained unheated was the outhouse. Not only was it perpetually freezing, but the bay previously used by the sewage truck had frozen solid by the 3rd of the month, and the accumulated contents of the entire outhouse were alarmingly close to overflowing the toilet seat. It was utterly repulsive and perpetually frozen, transforming into my personal nightmare to utilize. I would readily opt for a slit trench over an outhouse any day of the week. Even to this day, the mere recollection of that colossal frozen mound causes me to wince. I can still visualize the wisps of steam that would emanate from the hole and out of the portable toilet's vents after each use. Nevertheless, despite the sheer oddity of the outhouse, it does not constitute the truly frightening aspect of this narrative. One particular night, as the four of us reclined on our cots, preparing for sleep, some of us were engrossed in a book on tape that Doc had brought along. I believe the title was Contact. Our entertainment choices were limited to either that or Art Bell's Coast to Coast radio program, which was the only English-language station we could tune into. For those unfamiliar, Art Bell's show primarily focused on topics such as extraterrestrial beings, Bigfoot, and various other paranormal phenomena. Suddenly, we became aware of noises emanating from outside. While this might not immediately strike one as terrifying, allow me to explain. We had barely heard any sounds, day or night, since our arrival. There is very little activity occurring in this isolated location, particularly on a freezing island with limited wildlife. We had not observed any animals or discovered any tracks throughout our entire deployment, despite undertaking a considerable amount of walking. Initially, we speculated it might be some local indigenous youths who had come to cause mischief, perhaps to vandalize the site or set it ablaze. This seemed a logical assumption, as prior to our deployment to this island, we had been given tours of nearby logging camps that had been utterly devastated. We had been explicitly cautioned that similar destruction would befall our camp if we failed to adequately protect it. If these youths were indeed the source of the commotion, we believed we were prepared for them. Well, to be entirely honest, no, we weren't. Who was I kidding? We would have desired to load our weapons and assume an offensive posture, were it not for the crucial detail that we were ostensibly on a training exercise. This designation meant we possessed no ammunition whatsoever. We had M16 rifles, but nothing to load into them. This had not presented an issue until this point, as there had been a complete absence of perceived danger. None of us were still reclining on our cots. Instead, we were all rapidly getting dressed and deliberating which one of us would venture out to investigate with an unloaded rifle. Just then, those identical sounds reached our door. The sounds were unequivocally not human. We could clearly hear something breathing heavily and loudly. Our private first class, who had been designated to lead the reconnaissance, unequivocally refused to go. None of us held it against him. We certainly did not wish for this situation to devolve into some Alaskan iteration of Southern Comfort meets Predator, if you understand my implication. Consequently, we all remained in profound silence for approximately 10 minutes or so, until the huffing and snorting noises gradually receded. A few minutes later, we mustered our courage and cautiously opened the door. Immediately visible in the snow were the largest wolf prints I had ever encountered. I swear they were the size of a dinner plate. Whatever creature bore those paws must have been the size of a small horse, or at the very least, a dining room table. We sprang into action, believing we might need to deter an entire pack of wolves. We began by suspending a series of lanterns along the camp's perimeter, and then activated the generator to illuminate the lights along the actual buildings. Following that, we ignited large, roaring fires within sizable steel drums to combat the cold. We had previously used these drums during storms to help us navigate to the outhouse. The wolves began to howl as we continued our efforts. Some of my comrades suggested they were attempting to outflank us, employing their howls to try and compel us to move in their desired direction. I must concede, it very nearly succeeded. When that piercing sound erupts from a tree stand no more than 30 yards away from you,